There's a stillness in the air when you first step outside at dusk, the kind that clings to the stones and settles on your skin like a hush. The clouds are heavy, but not threatening, just a slow-moving ceiling over a world getting ready to sleep. In another time, a much older time, you might have seen a different sort of evening. Perhaps there'd be no lantern flickering in your hand, no paved path beneath your feet, just wet grass under tired boots, just the smoke from a distant fire curling in the wind, and the scent, not lavender or rain, but something rawer. Sour ale, damp linen, maybe a thin, metallic tongue in the breeze. In that world, you would not be walking home from work or stretching before bed. You might be standing in a low, foul-smelling tent, wiping your hands on a stiff apron while a wounded soldier groans on a straw-stuffed mat. No proper tools, no real training. Only a blade, a bowl, and a grim determination to get it over with. This was the world of the medieval barber-surgeon. Not quite a doctor, not just a barber. A strange liminal figure who might shear your beard in the morning and saw off your leg in the afternoon. Who might set your broken ribs with the same confidence he sharpened razors. A man shaped not by scholarship or science, but by blood, guesswork, and hard-won habit. You did what you could, and what you could do was often not enough. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with him. Walk beside him. Sit inside the battlefield tent and listen to the creaking of wooden tables, the soft rustle of linen bandages, the low moans of the dying. You'll see the world from his eyes, and it may not be comforting, but in the telling, in the slow, soft unfolding of a brutal past, perhaps you'll find a stillness, a place to drift, to rest, to remember how far we've come. This is Deep History for Sleepers. If you're still listening later, I'd love to know what part stayed with you. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your focus soften. We begin, not in a castle, not in a monastery, but under canvas, where the air is thick and time stands still. The sun is setting on a torn and weary field. The banners of men lie tattered on the ground, trampled by hooves and boots, and the dragging wheels of rough wooden carts. Crows circle overhead, not yet old enough to descend. The smell of blood is sharp, mixing with the reek of manure, sweat, and the distant stink of rotting meat. Somewhere nearby, a man screams, short, sharp, and then silence. You duck beneath the flap of the surgeon's tent. The fabric is stained in shades that once might have been white. The light inside is dim, filtered through layers of oil-soaked cloth, with only a few sputtering candles jammed into empty bottles to keep back the dark. It is not clean. It is not sterile. It is not quiet. In this space, a man named Leofric bends over a patient. He is not a doctor, not as we would know one, but he has a knife in his hand, and that is enough. He wears no gloves. His apron, once stiff canvas, is mottled and shiny from old blood. He hums under his breath, a nervous habit, as he reaches for a bowl of liquid nearby. It is ale, not because he prefers it, but because the water is worse. Ale is safer to drink than the local stream, which carries the runoff of latrines, slaughterhouses, and decomposing bodies. It's weak, barely intoxicating. Children drink it. Soldiers drink it. And so does the surgeon, though not only for thirst. He dips his hands in it before a procedure, not to sanitize, but to wash. It does little, but there is something comforting in the ritual, a gesture that pretends at cleanliness. His tools are simple: a curved knife, a bone saw, short and blunt-toothed, a clamp that sometimes works, a roll of linen torn from an old shift, a hot iron resting on coals, waiting to cauterize. He sharpened the blade earlier on a whetstone, humming the same half-song as now, lips pressed tight, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. The patient is young, no more than 20. His leg is mangled below the knee. A sword blow? A crushing fall? No one knows. He's barely conscious. Leofric doesn't ask his name. It won't change the outcome. There is no anesthesia. Sometimes they bite on a stick. Other times, nothing. If they're lucky, they pass out early. If they're not, well, Leofric works fast. But not too fast. He's learned to wait just long enough after cutting, not out of malice, but because the bleeding needs to slow. Tie the tourniquet too tight too soon, and the flesh becomes slippery, harder to manage. Wait too long, and he loses him. There's a rhythm to this, as with all things. Cut, clamp, saw, cauterize, wrap, breathe, and then wash your hands in ale. Again, later, he will bury the leg outside the camp, or burn it if there's firewood to spare. He'll wipe his blade on a rag, maybe drink the rest of that ale, and then there will be another. Elsewhere in the tent, a boy of 12 stirs a pot over a brazier. He is the apprentice. His hands are red and cracked, fingers swollen from the cold. His job is to boil linens, not because it kills germs, for that idea does not yet exist, but because it keeps the cloth soft and pliable. And maybe, just maybe, it makes them feel cleaner. He also fetches the next patient, mops the blood, holds the limbs down when needed. His name is Edric, but few say it. He is simply boy. He has not been told how to feel about what he sees, so he doesn't. He folds his face into the shape of quiet obedience. But at night, when he lies curled in a bed of straw beside the horses, he dreams of cleaner places, of hands that hold books, not saws. Outside the tent, the sounds of the camp murmur and shiver. A priest mutters prayers for the dying. A blacksmith pounds bent armor into shape. Dogs bark, fight, whimper. The war has paused for the night, but only just. The wounded keep arriving. The tent never sleeps. In the corner, Leofric sharpens his blade again. There is always another. What kind of man becomes a barber-surgeon? The answer is simple. The kind who cannot afford not to. Barber-surgeons are not noble. They do not study at universities or wear long robes. They do not speak Latin or read ancient texts. They train as apprentices, learning by watching and doing. Most began as barbers, cutting hair, shaving beards, pulling teeth. And then one day, someone asked for more. A boil to be lanced, a shoulder to be set, a cyst to be drained. Little by little, the barber becomes something more, not a doctor, not a healer, but something in between. He carries a red and white pole outside his tent when in town, a symbol of blood and bandages, a signal of what he offers. In the field, there are no poles, only the tent, the tools, and the endless line of broken men. He has no formal license, no parchment bearing a seal. His training is the meat of men, real, living, suffering flesh. He has learned what stops the bleeding, what wounds fester, what smells like death before it arrives. And he has learned, above all, how to endure. Because the hardest part is not the blood, it's the helplessness, the knowing that what you do may not work, that your best efforts might still end in death, that your tools are too crude, your knowledge too thin, but you do it anyway, because someone must. And now it's night. The tent is quiet for a moment. The brazier glows low. Edric sleeps sitting up, head resting on his knees. Leofric leans against a post, eyes half shut, blade resting across his lap. The cloth that hangs over the tent's entrance stirs in the breeze. Somewhere outside, the moon slips behind a cloud. There is no celebration here, no victory. Just a strange kind of silence, layered over the groans, the dripping, the shallow breaths. A silence made not of peace, but of exhaustion. Leofric does not dream anymore. He closes his eyes only to rest them, and when he opens them again, he will rise, dip his hands in ale, sharpen the blade, and begin again. The air is colder in the morning. Not crisp or refreshing, just wet. The kind of cold that seeps through every layer of wool and into your bones. Outside the surgeon's tent, dew clings to trampled grass, now matted and red-brown from yesterday's blood. Flies have already risen. They hum in lazy spirals over the waste heap near the camp's edge, drawn to the scent of rot and open wounds. Inside, the brazier is still warm, a small mercy. Edric stirs beside it, curled into the thin blanket he managed to find under a cot. His fingers are still smudged from the day before. He stretches slowly, joints stiff, and begins the morning tasks without being told. The linens from yesterday's work are stiff with blood. He peels them apart carefully, one by one, and drops them into a bucket of water. The water clouds red almost immediately. He will heat it later, boil what he can, then hang the cloths to dry from the guy ropes outside. If they survive the day without being stolen, it will be a small victory. Leofric is already awake. He has not truly slept, just dozed, in snatches, the way men do when there is too much to be done, and not enough time to feel the weight of it. He sits near the low table, carefully inspecting his tools in the dim light. The curved knife needs attention. He sharpens it with a steady hand, slow and even strokes against the whetstone. It calms him. The sound is soothing in its way, a rasping whisper, regular as breath. The knife has been with him for years. He bought it in a town he barely remembers, from a blacksmith with one eye and 3 fingers. It has a slight bend in the middle now, not quite noticeable to the eye, but Leofric feels it when he cuts. He's learned to work around it, to adjust the angle, shift his wrist. Little adaptations made over time, unnoticed by others. Just part of the rhythm now. He finishes sharpening, tests the edge on his thumb. It leaves a faint white line in the skin, no blood. Sharp enough. From outside, the first sounds of the camp wake and drift in. A clatter of armor, a shouted order, a horse snorting, restless and hungry. Somewhere, a cookpot clangs, and the thin scent of boiled oats drifts in on the breeze. Then, the unmistakable sound of boots. Fast, purposeful, coming toward the tent. Leofric looks up. Edric does too. A man bursts through the flap. A soldier, pale and sweating. His hand is pressed to his side, blood oozing between his fingers. "Help," he gasps, before crumpling forward. They move fast. Leofric does not shout. He never shouts. He lifts the soldier under the arms, grunting slightly, and hauls him onto the table. Edric is already fetching water, ale, again, and the cleaner cloths. The boy's face is set in a mask of focus, his hands moving without hesitation. This is not his first morning like this. Leofric peels back the man's tunic. The wound is deep, ragged, and still bleeding heavily. A sword, likely. Not clean. None are. The edges of the gash are uneven, torn rather than sliced. There is grit in it, bits of cloth, maybe mud, maybe worse. There is no time to clean it properly. He pours the ale over it, the man jerking and groaning. Not out of infection prevention. That concept lies centuries away, but because sometimes it helps to flush away debris. Sometimes he probes gently, not too deep. He has no means to go digging for anything that might have lodged inside. All he can do is stop the bleeding, close the wound, and pray the man's body will not turn against him later. He presses linen to the gash, hard. The soldier arches in pain, but does not scream. Good. Conscious means living. For now. Leofric ties the bandage off. He will not stitch it. He has no catgut left, and needlework on this kind of wound is as likely to trap rot inside as to hold things closed. Better to bind it tight, pack it if needed, and let the body do what it can. He rests a hand lightly on the man's shoulder for a moment, before stepping back. A strange gesture. Not quite comfort, not quite farewell. The man's name? He still doesn't know. Later, when the sun is higher, Leofric sits on the ground outside the tent, letting the light warm his face. He doesn't look toward the battlefield. He's seen it too many times. The littered dead, the groaning half alive, the slow, pitiful crawl of men trying to return to camp on their own. He doesn't need to see it to know. Instead, he watches the boy. Edric is hanging the linens carefully, pinning them with small wooden pegs. His motions are practiced now, efficient. It has taken months, but he no longer flinches at the stains. He no longer asks where they came from. The boy used to ask questions. Why do we do this? Why don't we clean with water? Why does the leg turn black after we cut it off? Leofric had answers, of a sort. Half-truths and guesses. Some he'd heard from other surgeons. Some he'd learned the hard way. Some he invented on the spot because the truth that they don't know, not really, was too heavy to give a child. But now, Edric no longer asks. He moves like a shadow, a silent second set of hands. Leofric isn't sure if this is good or bad, just that it is what happens. The wind picks up slightly, rustling the linens. Somewhere nearby, a priest chants softly over the body of a dead knight. The words drift like incense, weightless, meaningless, soothing. Leofric does not believe in saints, not anymore. Not since the winter siege, the fire, the girl whose arm he cut too slow. He believes in sharp blades, in clean bandages, in not waiting too long to act, and sometimes in ale. The camp surgeon's tent is not a place of healing, not in the way you might hope. It is a place of surviving, of scraping through, of cutting away what might kill, and praying the patient lives long enough to recover. There is no silence here. Even in the moments between, there is always sound. The flies, the wind, the distant sobbing of someone learning they will never walk again. But there are small things, glimpses, the moment when the bleeding stops, when a fever breaks, when a man who is silent for days opens his eyes and asks for bread. These are the victories, not the grand, glorious ones sung in halls or carved in stone, but the quiet ones, a breath, a heartbeat, a hand gripping yours as if to say, not yet. Leofric knows he will not be remembered. His name will not appear in the chronicles. No one will write poems about the man who sewed up a gut wound in the rain, or who reset a shattered arm with a bit of wood and a prayer. But he does not need to be remembered. He just needs to be there. When the next man stumbles in, half dead and wild-eyed, when Edric drops the cloth and whispers, "He's coming in now." When the sun sets again and the tent fills with breath, blood, and pain, he will sharpen his knife, dip his hands in ale, and begin again. The midweek, the tent smells worse than ever. Not of filth, exactly. That word doesn't quite hold the right weight. It is something deeper, something layered. Beneath the sharp metallic bite of blood and the faint sourness of unwashed bodies, there is a heaviness, like mold or rot, a thickness in the air that clings to the back of your throat, that no candle or herb bundle can quite cover. Leofric lights them anyway. Dried rosemary when he can get it, mugwort, sometimes. The scent curls upward in pale smoke, thin fingers reaching toward the tent's low ceiling. The wounded are placed in rows now, on rough mats or low pallets, barely inches from one another. There is no privacy, no space for quiet. Every groan, every whispered prayer, every wet cough becomes part of the landscape. You do not get used to it, but you learn to let it fade to the background. Today, a man has arrived with a shattered arm, a cavalryman tossed from his horse after taking a blow to the chest. He's half-conscious, teeth gritted, and his fingers twitch with pain as Leofric peels away the ruined sleeve. The flesh is purple and swelling fast, the bones beneath warped and displaced. It must be reset. There is no choice. Leofric does not hesitate. He wraps the man's forearm in a strip of linen so he can hold it without slipping, and braces the upper arm against his own knee. He counts under his breath, not for the patient, but for himself. Then pulls. The crack is muffled. The man lets out a scream that curdles in the air, like milk left too long. His body jerks once, then sags. Unconscious now, easier in some ways. Leofric works quickly. He splints the arm with wood scavenged from a broken crate, ties it with clean strips. His fingers are steady, always steady. Edric hands him a damp cloth. The boy's eyes flick to the man's face, and quickly away. Leofric nods once, good work, then moves on. There are 3 more waiting outside. In quieter moments, the 2 of them sometimes speak. Not often. Words are a luxury neither has energy for. But sometimes. Will he live? Edric asks once, after a particularly grueling amputation. Leofric shrugs. Maybe. It is the most honest answer he can give. Infection is always a shadow at the door. Even the cleanest wound can sour, puff up with heat, and turn purple with poison. Pus runs fast through broken bodies. And once it starts, there is little to do. Why don't they send better surgeons? Edric asks another time. They do, Leofric replies, wiping his blade clean. To the nobles. And it's true. The noble commanders have their own tents, their own learned physicians, men in long robes who carry books and speak Latin. But when one of their own bleeds too much or needs a leg removed in the field, it's the barber-surgeon who's called. The physician consults. Leofric cuts. He does not resent them, or perhaps he did, once, long ago. Now he simply accepts. The world is divided. Those who suffer and those who prescribe. His place has always been among the suffering. In the early afternoon, it begins to rain. The canvas roof of the tent leaks in places. Thin streams run down the walls and gather in shallow puddles on the packed earth floor. The wounded pull their blankets tighter. One man begins to shiver uncontrollably. Another coughs blood into a rag. Leofric walks among them, checking bandages, feeling for fever. The ones who can speak whisper thanks. The ones who cannot simply stare. Their eyes are wide, always wide. There is a boy no older than 15, bandaged from hip to thigh. He clutches a wooden cross in his hands. It's not his. Leofric knows that. He's seen it around the neck of another soldier days earlier, a man who did not survive. The boy must have taken it. He holds it like a lifeline, like a promise. Drink, Leofric murmurs, pressing a cup to the boy's lips. The boy tries. Most spills down his chin. Edric watches silently from the side of the tent. His hands are stained to the wrist. He doesn't bother wiping them anymore. You were right, he says quietly when Leofric returns. About the herbs. They don't help. Leofric smiles. A tired, crooked thing. No, but they smell better than shit. Edric doesn't laugh. He rarely does. But he nods. The rain picks up. One of the candles gutters out with a hiss. Outside, the battlefield sinks deeper into mud. Horses flounder. Men curse. And the line of wounded grows again. Leofric sharpens his blade, slowly, by candlelight. The worst part is not the blood. Not the pus, or the smell, or the dying. It's the choices. There are only so many bandages. Only so much ale. Only so many hours in the day. And too many wounded. Leofric must decide who to treat, and who to leave. A man with a gut wound, weeping and fevered. He is beyond help. He will be left to his pain, perhaps given a mouthful of poppy juice if there's any left. Another with both legs crushed beneath a wagon. He cannot be saved. They may cut one, but not both, and there's no stretcher. No place for him. A boy with an arrow in his thigh, however, that one can be treated. If the arrow hasn't shattered the bone, and if the fletching hasn't dragged too much cloth into the wound. He'll cut around it, remove it clean, bind it tight. It is cruel, but it is necessary. Edric once asked, "How do you choose?" Leofric did not answer right away. Then, softly, "I choose the ones who might thank me in the morning. The others, the silent, the fading, they are mourned, but from a distance. There is no time to grieve, only to work, to clean, to cut, to bandage, to whisper a few words that might bring comfort, even when you do not believe them yourself." That night, a soldier dies quietly near the tent wall. He had been silent all day, breathing shallowly, staring at the roof. Leofric had cleaned his wound, packed it with herbs, done what he could. Now the breath stops. Edric is the one who notices. He places 2 fingers beneath the jaw, waits, looks to Leofric, nods. They cover the body with a linen sheet. There is no ceremony, no song, just a stillness deeper than the others. A space where something used to be. The boy sits beside the body for a while, unmoving. Leofric does not disturb him. Later, he will help carry the corpse to the pyre or to the ditch. He will cut another bandage, hold another limb, fetch another bowl of ale. But for now, there is quiet. And it is for a moment enough. Not all days are like this. Some are worse. But some, too, are better. A man wakes after 3 days of fever, blinks, and asks for meat. Another sits up with a laugh when his bandages are changed. "You've done it," he says. "I still have the leg," Leofric shrugs. "For now." But inside, a flicker of warmth, a brief light held close. These are the moments that matter. Not the knives or the saws or the endless sharpening. Not even the saving, in the grand sense. Just the trying, the reaching out across the dark, the lighting of one small flame in a place full of shadows. And always the ale, because there's never enough water. The wind shifts. It comes from the west today, carrying the scent of burned wood and wet leather. The battlefield is quiet for now, not because the war is over, but because there are too few men left to fight. The grass, once tall and green, is churned into mud. Here and there, scraps of fabric flutter from broken spears. Helmets sit abandoned in ditches, half filled with rain. The dead, most of them, have already been buried or dragged away. But the ground still remembers. Every step squelches. Every breath tastes of decay. Inside the tent, life goes on. The life is a generous word. The wounded sleep in uneven rows. Some breathe easily. Some do not. A few talk in their sleep, their voices thin and reedy. One man repeats the name Isolde again and again, even after Leofric has cut off his leg. He doesn't wake. His hands clutch at the air. Edric watches from the side, peeling strips of dried linen apart and rolling them tightly for packing. His fingers are raw again. The cold has returned with the wind. It seeps in under the canvas walls and pools around their feet. The brazier helps a little, but not enough. There's never enough wood. Never enough of anything. Leofric warms his hands briefly, then begins cleaning his instruments. Again. Always again. The knife, the saw, the clamp, the same tools day after day. There are no replacements. No hidden drawers of fresh steel. When the blade dulls, he sharpens it. When it breaks, he files it into something smaller and carries on. Some days, he dreams of more, of delicate instruments like the ones he's heard of in distant cities. Hooks, forceps, needles curved like the moon. But they are dreams only. This is the battlefield. Here, you make do. A messenger arrives at midday. He is young and thin, wearing a surcoat too large for his narrow frame. His hair is plastered flat from rain. He ducks inside the tent, squinting against the gloom. "They say you're needed," he says. "A knight's been wounded. Bad. The commander says send your best." Leofric raises an eyebrow, but says nothing. The messenger shifts nervously. That's you, right? Leofric wipes his hands on his apron. Where is he? Near the main road, his tents marked with a black banner. Edric steps forward, already gathering the tools. He knows the drill. The good ones go to the important tents. The rest stay behind. Leofric packs the essentials in a leather roll. The curved knife, the bone saw, the stitching needle, the last bit of catgut, a flask of ale, a packet of dried moss, one clean cloth. It's all he can carry. The knight's tent is different, larger, cleaner, a brazier on each corner. The floor is covered in rushes and straw, and there is even a chair, real wood, not a crate, for the surgeon to sit on. The knight lies on a padded cot, groaning softly. His leg is bandaged, but the cloth is soaked through, dark red to black. The stink is already there, that faint, sweet rot that means the flesh is turning. Leofric unwraps the dressing slowly. The wound is jagged, rimmed with black. Infection has begun to spread up the thigh. It won't stop. He glances at the physician standing nearby. A thin man in a long robe, hands tucked into his sleeves, watching, not helping. He needs the leg off, Leofric says. The physician frowns. Are you certain? We could try ointments. Leofric shakes his head. Too late. The knight stirs, eyes fluttering open. What? You've taken a wound, the physician says gently. But this man will tend to it. Leofric doesn't wait for more. He nods to Edric, who sets out the tools quickly. The brazier here is better, hotter. Leofric places the iron in the coals and lets it heat. He leans close to the knight. You'll feel it, but only for a while. The knight's eyes widen. He tries to sit up. No, wait, but it's already begun. The cut is clean. The saw follows. Leofric works quickly, efficiently, his face calm. He does not flinch, does not pause. The bone gives way with a soft crunch. The blood spurts, then slows. The iron hisses as it meets the wound. The knight screams. Then silence. He is alive. For now. Leofric wraps the stump, secures it tight, and leans back. His hands shake a little. Not from fear, just fatigue. The physician murmurs something. Approval, perhaps. Maybe not. Edric packs the tools away, quietly. They leave without thanks. Back at the tent, things are worse. 2 men have died in their absence. One bled out, unnoticed. The other choked in his sleep. There is no time to dwell on it. The boy strips their pallets. Leofric checks the others. A man with burns across his chest. Another with a crushed foot. A third who simply stares, silent, blinking, unmoving. Leofric kneels beside him. What's your name? No answer. He places a hand on the man's shoulder. You're safe here, for now. Still nothing. Sometimes the body survives, but the mind does not. He leaves him, gently, quietly. There is another patient waiting. There is always another. That night, the tent is quiet, a rare thing. Most of the wounded sleep. The wind has eased. Even the fire crackles softly, no longer snapping like a whip. Leofric sits with his back against the post. His knife rests across his knees, half cleaned. He hasn't the strength to finish it tonight. Edric dozes nearby, wrapped in his thin blanket. His face is slack in sleep, younger than it seems when he's awake. The tent breathes. Outside, the battlefield exhales. Men snore in tents, or murmur in dreams. The grass drinks the dew. Somewhere, an owl calls once, and then falls silent. You are here now, sitting with Leofric, listening to the wind tug at the canvas, watching the embers glow and fade. There is nothing to do. No rush. The war, for now, is paused. In the stillness, you remember the weight of hands, the way a knife sings on a whetstone. The quiet rhythm of trying and trying again, even when the world forgets you. This is not glory. It is something else. It is the soft, unseen work of keeping others alive. You dip your hands in ale and begin again. The sky had been gray for 3 days. Not the moody gray of passing weather, but a dull, unbroken sheet of cloud that stretched from one side of the horizon to the other. It pressed low over the fields, over the tents, over the bent shoulders of the men who walked among the mud and the memories. Rain had fallen in the night, soft, steady, unremarkable, and in the morning it clung to everything. The banners hung limp with dampness. The horses shifted restlessly in their lines. And near the top of the hill, in a tent larger than most, and lined with rushes that had long since begun to rot, a nobleman lay dying. He had once been a powerful figure. This man, the kind of noble who could send letters sealed with wax and expect men to march on the strength of his name alone. His titles were long, his cloak heavy, his voice once so commanding that entire rooms quieted when he entered. But now, his eyes were sunken with fever, and his leg, wrapped in a bandage soaked through with old blood, had begun to smell of rot. His name was Lord Aldred of Eglinstone, and the wound that had brought him here, a jagged tear from a rusted lance during a skirmish no one would remember, had slowly become a sentence. There had been physicians, of course, learned men, cloaked in layers of wool and confidence, who burned herbs and mumbled Latin while waving ornate instruments in the air. They had tried every powder and tonic they could carry in their satchels. They had smeared salves across the blackening skin and sent servants out to crush poppy seeds into drink. But nothing had helped. Aldred's leg had darkened, hardened, and then begun to ooze. By the second morning, he no longer recognized his advisors. By the third, he had stopped speaking altogether. And so, with the hush of desperation that cloaks all things near death, someone had whispered the name of the battlefield surgeon. Leofric was not a man for courts or scrolls. He did not wear robes or speak in riddles. But he had seen more wounded men than any of the Duke's scholars ever would. He had cut into more flesh than he could name. He had lost more and saved a few. And now, standing quietly at the edge of a nobleman's cot, with a rusted saw wrapped in linen and a strip of catgut tucked into his apron, he looked at the blackened leg and said very little. There was nothing to say. No one objected. The learned physicians had stepped back into the shadows, hands folded neatly into their sleeves. A few watched with furrowed brows, unwilling to speak aloud the quiet surrender in their posture. Others turned away. The room felt suddenly colder. Leofric asked no permission, but Aldred, eyes half-glazed and flickering, gave the smallest of nods. Not of courage, not of hope, just acknowledgement. He understood. It was time. The operation was brief and brutal. There were no drawn curtains, no instruments bathed in spirit or flame. Just a sharpened blade, a bone saw, a heated iron, and the calloused hands of a man who had done this far too many times. Edric, ever nearby, handed each tool without a word. The blood came quickly, then less so. The leg, such as it was, came free with a heavy thud. The heat of the cauterizing iron filled the tent with a scent that no one could ever forget. Scorched meat, cloth, sweat, and the thick, cloying fog of something half alive turning still. When it was over, Leofric stepped back. His breathing had not changed. His hands moved steadily, as they always did, binding the stump in clean linen soaked in moss. He left the tent without ceremony. No one stopped him. There was no applause. Just silence, and the soft hiss of the brazier still glowing near the cot. That night, it rained again. The wind shifted westward, and Aldred, improbably, did not die. By morning, a murmur had spread through the camp, not loud, not yet proud, but there, carried in low voices between tent rows. The Duke had woken. the surgeon's cut had worked. Against what everyone expected, the fever had not returned. By the third day, Aldred asked for broth. On the fourth, for wine. And on the fifth, he sat upright and dictated a message to his scribes. His leg was gone, but his presence had returned. It seemed impossible, but it had happened. The transformation in camp was subtle, but real. The men who had once spoken of the Duke in the past tense now stood a little taller. Flags were raised again. Even the guards at the tent flap looked more alert, as though they too had been pulled back from some invisible edge. And somewhere between the whisper and the telling, the act became a tale. In the weeks that followed, the story grew. It was said that Aldred had stared down death itself, and that the surgeon, unnamed in the first versions, had performed the cutting with divine steadiness. Some said a holy light had filled the tent. Others swore the rain had stopped for a moment at the final stroke. It was nonsense, of course, but the kind people needed to believe, because war was not about facts. It was about stories, and stories could hold a kingdom together, even as it bled. Leofric said nothing. He continued his work in the surgeon's tent, a little closer now to the command circle, though still very much apart. He received new bandages, better ale, a slightly sharper saw. Someone even delivered boots, not new, but dry. Edric noticed the change more than Leofric did. He watched as soldiers nodded in passing, as servants no longer avoided his eyes. For a brief moment, the air around them had shifted, but Leofric did not linger in it. The Duke's leg was gone, and the kingdom had not yet fallen. That was all. Work remained. Later, perhaps someone would paint the moment. A monk in a scriptorium would brush gold leaf onto the edge of the page, showing Aldred bathed in candlelight, hands clasped in prayer, the surgeon kneeling beside him like a saint. The saw would be clean, the linens white, the pain absent. It would become part of the greater myth, the leg that turned the tide, the wound that saved the East. A sigil might even be made, a silver blade over black cloth, carried by knights who had not been there, believed by those who never saw the mud or smelled the cauterized stump. But in the quiet tent, on the day it happened, there was only the soft shuffle of boots on straw, only the hiss of iron, only the breath of a man who had come very near to death, and returned not by miracle, but by the edge of a blade held by steady hands. The amputation did not save a kingdom, but it gave it a pause, a moment. A thread of belief stretched thin across the mud and doubt and exhaustion. And sometimes that is enough. And Leofric, still wiping the blade with damp cloth, did not think of stories. He only thought of the next patient, because there would always be another. The days that followed the Duke's recovery settled like a soft mist across the camp, pale and quiet. Time, which had once crept with a sick heaviness, now moved more steadily, though still without haste. Morning brought the slow clang of the cookpots and the clipped steps of messengers crossing the damp fields. The war had not ended, of course. There were still skirmishes in the east, and enemy scouts were spotted often enough to keep the guards tense at dusk. But the center of the army no longer felt hollow. It beat again, like a heart, slow but certain. Within this slow rhythm, Leofric's life returned to its familiar routines. He rose early, before the frost had finished fading from the grasses, and began his rounds. The sick, the shivering, the ones burned or split open or pierced by things sharp and rusted, they waited for him in silence. There was rarely weeping. Most of the men who came to him had already crossed a threshold inside themselves, a kind of private agreement with pain. They were ready to be cut, sewn, drained, or cauterized. They had seen what happened to those who waited too long. What changed, in the wake of Aldred's survival, was not the wounds themselves, but the way the wounded looked at him. Not with hope, necessarily, but with a kind of recognition, as though he had become something larger than a man. as though the blade in his hand now held a second edge, sharpened by story. Some asked to touch it. Others thanked him before he even spoke. A few wept after he was done, quietly, like rain slipping off canvas. Leofric said little. He never did, but he noticed. And Edric, the boy who followed him with thread and bowl, noticed even more. Edric, who had once been ignored at best and scolded at worst, was now greeted with quiet nods and the occasional word of thanks. He began to carry himself differently, too not proud, but steadier. He had seen what a knife could do, and he had stayed through the worst of it. That was enough to change a person. One afternoon, a man arrived from the southern front. He had ridden for 2 days, and his horse collapsed just after the tent came into view. His face was drawn and colorless. His left arm wrapped in a cloth, soaked through, and re-wrapped with something that looked like moss. Beneath it, the flesh had turned sour, and the skin was streaked with the dark veins of infection. They did not ask questions. They laid him down, offered him poppy water, and did what they always did. Leofric opened the arm with practiced precision. The rot had reached the elbow. It would have to come off. As he worked, Edric whispered something. Leofric didn't hear at first, then nodded. The man was awake, watching. "Will I live?" he asked, through clenched teeth. "If the fever doesn't stay," Leofric said. It was as close to comfort as he ever gave. The cut was clean, the stump sealed. The man lived. 3 more that week. 2 lived. 1 did not. By the middle of the month, there were visitors. They did not wear armor or carry weapons. Their robes were fine, their shoes soft. Courtiers from the western estates, sent to deliver news and carry back details about the Duke's recovery. They came in carriages. Their hands were clean. They smelled of cloves and honey. Leofric watched them from a distance at first. Then one morning, they came to his tent. The eldest, a man with a long beard and a silver clasp at his throat, introduced himself with a flourish. He thanked Leofric for his service to the kingdom. He spoke of Aldred in poetic terms. Then he asked if the surgeon would mind being painted. Painted. Leofric blinked. Ben slowly shook his head. The courtier smiled as if he had expected nothing less. They left behind a parcel of dried fruit and a pair of gloves stitched in red thread. Leofric gave the fruit to Edric. He never wore the gloves. But the story continued to travel. In the villages, far from the mud and tents, minstrels began to sing a ballad. The Surgeon of the Ire Ridge, they called him. The verses spoke of a man who cut with mercy and saved with fire, of a duke who rose from death, of a blade that glowed with light. No mention of moss or mud or the stink of blood baked into cloth. But that was how tales were told. One cold evening, as the frost rimmed the edges of the basin and smoke coiled low over the tents, Leofric sat beside the fire and sharpened his knife. Edric watched. "Do you believe them?" the boy asked. Leofric looked at him. "The songs." There was a long pause. Then, "No." Another pause. "But they believe us." Leofric didn't answer. He just kept sharpening. Because somewhere out beyond the trees, beyond the wet roads and wooden stakes, another battle would begin. And someone would scream. And someone else would be carried, barely breathing, to a tent. And that, not the songs, was what mattered. Because the kingdom was still bleeding. And he still had work to do. The frost came earlier than expected that year. It slid silently into the valleys before the last harvest was gathered, curling along the thatch and whispering against the edges of canvas tents. Men woke to find their breath rising like ghosts in the morning chill, and their fingers stiff from the cold before the sun had even cleared the ridge. Fires were fed constantly, but the wood was damp, and the smoke clung to everything: hair, skin, the rough wool of cloaks. It was a season for quiet suffering. The battlefield surgeon's tent, like everything else, grew colder. The warmth of summer's urgency had faded. Now wounds healed slower. Blood clotted sluggishly. The sick lingered longer, often slipping into fever, not in the heat of infection, but from the steady drain of cold on a weakened body. Leofric adapted, as he always had. He lined the table with moss he had dried himself, now brittle and warm to the touch when soaked in broth. He had Edric pack fresh bandages tighter, not just for compression, but for warmth. He spoke less now, though he'd never been one for speech. His hands, though those remained steady. Word of Lord Aldred's survival had long since left the camp. Beyond the ridges and rivers, it had already become something else legend. In manor halls and market squares, it was told with gestures and awe. How the nobleman who should have died had lived, not through courtly magic or saintly touch, but through the harsh edge of a surgeon's blade. And with every retelling, the surgeon's role became stranger, more distant from truth. Some said he was a monk. Others whispered he had no tongue, only his tools. A few swore he used no saw, only his hands and prayers. But within the camp, the truth remained visible. A man in a blood-stained apron, sleeves always rolled, who kept no icons and accepted no coin. A man whose cot sat on straw. A man who never left. That winter, he was more needed than ever. The frost did more than sap warmth. It changed the nature of the wounds. Men arrived with cracked skin that bled without even being cut. Blisters turned black from the cold. Feet were lost to long watches on frozen ground. And in the makeshift kitchens, burns became more common as cooks juggled pots over low flames, often with bare hands. The wounds were smaller, in some ways. No broad gashes from swords, no splintered arrows, but they multiplied, and they compounded. Infection was everywhere. Cold made everything slower. The body was slower to heal. Hope was slower to rise. Still, some survived. Some always did. One evening, a boy was brought in. He could not have been more than 15, barely bearded, with a limp that seemed to come from nowhere. His face was pale but dry, his breath shallow. He had stepped in an animal trap meant for foxes, an accident, a foolish one. But the trap had snapped shut on his ankle, and no one had noticed until the next morning. By then, the wound was already gray. Leofric did not scold. He asked no name. He examined the leg and nodded to Edric. The blade was made ready. The boy, already dosed with a crude draft, barely whimpered. It was a small amputation mid-calf, and one Leofric had done many times before. But as he worked, the tent was silent in a way that felt deeper than usual. Even Edric's breath felt held back. Perhaps it was the boy's age, or perhaps it was that he looked, as he lay there in the firelight, almost exactly like Edric had looked when he'd first arrived. Afterwards, the limb was wrapped carefully and placed beneath cloth. The boy would live. He would limp forever, but he would live. That was all Leofric ever promised. That night, when the fire burned low and Edric had finally begun to sleep, Leofric sat alone at the tent's entrance. He looked at the stars, thin and dim through the cold mist, and felt something inside him that was not sadness exactly, but an old, quiet ache. Not for the boy, not for the leg, but for the world itself. A place where survival was never guaranteed, and kindness was not often spoken aloud. The next day brought 5 new cases. 2 sword wounds, 1 pipe tear, a man with crushed ribs from falling under a wagon, and another with a frostbitten hand he had ignored too long. The usual, the routine. But in the quiet, in the rhythm of the binding and stitching and scraping away of rot, something had shifted. Not in Leofric, but in Edric. He had begun to hum. A low, tuneless thing. Barely there, but it filled the spaces between pain and silence. And when one of the wounded reached for his hand as the stitching began, Edric held it. Not every wound heals from the outside in. Winter deepened. The snow fell in sheets, sometimes for days. The camp grew smaller as patrols were pulled in, and fewer messages came from the front. Fires were rationed. Food was dry and often moldy. Men dreamed of spring, but never said so aloud. Lord Aldert sent a letter. It arrived sealed in green wax, tied with a crimson ribbon. It was addressed to the surgeon of the field. Inside, a simple message. I remember, I walk, I command. You gave back what none could. Leofric read it once, then handed it to Edric. He said nothing. The paper was later used to start the fire, because warmth, in the end, was more useful than words. The cold stayed for weeks. Then one morning, the birds returned. A sound like hope, thin and trembling in the trees. The snows finally broke in early March. They did not vanish so much as loosen, dripping away in small, clear rivulets that streaked the muddy ground with ribbons of silver. Where once the tents had sat in stiff silence, outlined by frost and rimmed with breath, now came the soft sounds of melting water pattering from canvas edges, boots squelching in thawed earth, the occasional birdsong creeping back into the air like something half remembered. The army, too, shifted, not in numbers, but in posture. The slouch of winter pulled itself upright. The camp grew restless. With the melt came mud, and with the mud came illness. As always, nature traded one hardship for another. Men who had braved the snow now coughed with fevers that drained the color from their lips. Water was everywhere, and clean in few places. Food stores ran low, and what remained often bore the soft gray blush of spoil. And through it all, the wounded kept coming. Leofric, as ever, remained in his tent. He did not count the seasons. He marked time in flesh, how it split, how it responded to poultices that changed with the weather. He marked time in smells, in the sourness of rot or the sharp, metallic scent of blood when the blade first broke skin. And he marked time in people, those who arrived broken and left whole, or at least living. One of them was a man named Osric. He had once been a stonemason before the war swept his village into its great indifferent mouth. He was built like a door frame, broad and flat, and had taken a pike wound to the thigh that had festered for days before he could be carried back. By the time he arrived, the infection had climbed almost to his hip. He was feverish, rambling, eyes flickering like candle flames. There was no choice. The leg had to come off, high and fast. It was the kind of cut that left no margin. Leofric had to work without hesitation, without flaw. The bone saw made a dry, rasping noise like old wood being split. Edric pressed a cloth to Osric's mouth as he moaned. The blood came quickly, then slowed, and then the limb was gone. The stitching took longer than usual. The stump was wrapped in warmed wool and pressed gently against the boy's belly for heat. For hours, the man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whispering the names of stones he once carved: sandstone, granite, flint. Leofric didn't know if it meant anything. He just kept checking the pulse, watching for fever, listening for breath. Osric lived, but the leg thick, strong, shaped by years of quarry work was burned. The camp watched the smoke. In the weeks that followed, Osric remained in the tent, unable to stand but eager to talk. He asked about the tools, about the black salve that stank like vinegar and garlic, about the curved needle Leofric used to close deep wounds. And then, one evening, he asked why Leofric had never left. The question sat there for a moment. Leofric looked at his hands. Then, quietly, he answered, "Because the wounds never do." Osric said nothing. After that, he stopped asking questions. Word reached the camp that the southern lords were gathering again. A new campaign would begin with the spring thaw, and those who could march would do so soon. Tents would be collapsed, gear loaded, routes redrawn. The war was not over, only paused by the ice, and with that return to motion came new arrivals. New flesh to be stitched, drained or spared. Among them was a nobleman's son, young, flaxen-haired, barely scarred by battle. He had been struck on the head during a skirmish, and now could not walk without assistance. He trembled at night and vomited most mornings. The other surgeons had declared it a ghost in the brain and left him in a side tent. Leofric watched him quietly for 2 days. Then, on the third, he approached. He had seen the signs before: a concussion, severe, and swelling. There was no cure, no salve, but there was an old method. Dangerous, primitive, banned in most cities, but sometimes it worked. Trepanning. It meant drilling into the skull, letting the pressure escape. It was not a thing Leofric did lightly, but the boy was fading. His pupils shrank unevenly. He spoke in half-sentences that seemed plucked from dreams. So Leofric prepared. The operation was silent. Edric did not assist. He could not bear to. The tool of crude burin filed from a broken lathe was clean with wine and flame. The boy was laid flat, his hair shaved, his forehead daubed with a paste of mugwort and vinegar. Then, with careful pressure, Leofric began to carve. The sound was unlike anything else, not quite cutting, not quite grinding, just a long, soft scrape, like a river stone being shaped. When the disc of bone came loose, there was a wet sigh of air, and slowly the boy's breathing steadied. He lived. 3 days later, he asked for broth. 5 days later, he stood. When he left, he bowed to Leofric, not as a surgeon, as something else, as if he had seen into that small dark hole carved in his own skull and found, somehow, the shape of mercy. That spring, Lord Aldred returned. He came not in triumph, but in quiet purpose, wrapped in a long dark cloak, walking with a staff. His hair had grown white at the temples. His eyes were hard, but he walked. He walked without help. He visited the tent. He looked at the cot where he had once nearly died. He looked at the tools. And then he looked at Leofric. "You saved me," he said. Leofric nodded. "But you saved more than me," Aldred continued, almost to himself. "You saved what followed. You gave the kingdom its spine back." Leofric didn't answer. Aldred stepped closer. "I came to ask what you need." There was a long silence. Then Leofric said, "Thread," a pause, "and salt." Aldred blinked, and he laughed quiet, raw. "You shall have both." He left behind a pouch of silver. Leofric gave it to the cook tent. Salt was bought in bulk. The thread was linen, strong and fine. The war went on. But in that tent, with its patched canvas and clumsy fire pit, with its rusted hooks and jars of herbs, a different kind of battle continued, one against rot and time and pain, and the quiet hopelessness that clung to the wounded like a second skin. And every time Leofric picked up the blade, he did not think of glory or of stories or of what the ballads might say. He only thought, live. There are nights in history that never quite end, even when the sun has long since risen. And this story begins in one of those nights. A time when knowledge walked with shadows, and certainty was more superstition than science. Picture yourself here, if you wish. You are in a small stone chamber, its air cool and still, lit only by a few smoky candles and the faintest shaft of moonlight slipping in through a narrow window. The floor beneath your feet is uneven, paved in rough cobbles worn smooth by centuries of passing feet. In a corner, a fire smolders low in a brazier. A curl of incense winds its way upward, not to cleanse the air, but to mask it, because the scent of this place is of iron and wet linen, of old books and human pain. The man in the center of the room is not quite a doctor, but he believes he heals. He wears no white coat, only a dark wool tunic, stiff with wear, and a thick apron over it, stained with substances no one has dared to name. Around him are his tools, laid out like an offering. Sharp, bone-handled knives, small glass vials, and forceps with iron jaws. Beside them, lined neatly on a cloth, are several leeches, black, glistening, and wriggling slowly in a shallow dish of water. They are alive. They are hungry. This is the world of the medieval practitioner, a strange place, balanced between folk wisdom and failing flesh, between divine intervention and desperate improvisation. It is a world where trepanning is not madness, but method, where bloodletting is not an error, but a cure, where the stars above and the humors within are seen as one and the same. If you are still listening later, I would love to know what part stayed with you. This is Deep History for Sleepers. Let us begin with bloodletting. Few practices in the long span of human medicine have endured so stubbornly. The idea is simple. Illness comes from imbalance. Too much blood? Drain it. Too much black bile? Purge it. The body was thought to be governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each linked to an element, a temperament, a planet in the sky. Balance meant health. Imbalance meant suffering. And so, out came the knives. Some incisions were shallow, made in the crook of the arm or just behind the ear. Others were deeper, guided by charts that marked which veins corresponded to which organs, as though the body were a map waiting to be corrected. Practitioners often carried these charts folded in waxed cloth, stained and annotated over time. Some even had circular diagrams, like wheels of fortune, that dictated the best times to bleed based on the alignment of the stars. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms. Cut in the wrong sign, and the patient might die. Or so it was believed. The tools were many: lancets, fleams, and the curious scarificator, a brass box with spring-loaded blades, used to puncture the skin in a clean, uniform grid. The device made a quick whirring click when activated, like a clock being wound. Blood flowed, sometimes in great volume. Towels were used until they became soaked. Patients often fainted, and this was considered a good sign. The excess had been purged. But bloodletting was not always done with knives. Sometimes it was done with leeches. The use of leeches dates back far beyond the medieval world, but it found a strange renaissance during these years of dim halls and battlefield tents. Medicinal leeches, known as Hirudo medicinalis, were bred or harvested in marshes and ponds. They were stored in damp cloth or glass jars and transported with great care. Some apothecaries specialized in them. A jar of fat, wriggling leeches was worth its weight in silver. When applied to the skin, usually behind the ears, under the jaw, or on the inner arm, leeches would attach themselves with small, patient determination. They did not bite so much as pierce and cling, secreting an anticoagulant in their saliva that kept blood flowing freely. It was not uncommon for a single leech to swell to several times its size before dropping off. The wound continued to bleed for hours afterward. This, too, was seen as beneficial. Some healers swore by them, others distrusted them, but they remained in use for centuries, disappearing and reappearing in strange cycles, tied to the waxing and waning of medical fashion. And in quiet corners of the world, they are still used today. Doubt there is a quiet dread in the act of boring a hole into the human skull. But in the medieval world, it was sometimes done with surprising calm. The practice was called trepanning or trepanation, and though it sounds to modern ears like something out of nightmare, it was once a deeply serious and at times respectable medical intervention. There was in it a strange kind of hope, a belief that by releasing pressure, draining spirits, or simply allowing the body to breathe more freely, one might banish the pain, seizures, or madness that haunted the afflicted. Imagine, if you will, a small village hut. Outside, the sounds of chickens, children, and wind-blown leaves rustling through trees. Inside, silence. A man lies on a wooden board, his face pale, his breath shallow. A cloth soaked in wine covers his mouth. His wife weeps silently in the corner, not wishing to watch, but unable to turn away. The practitioner, a barber-surgeon, or maybe just a local with reputation, prepares his tools. A small knife for cutting the scalp, a hand drill, perhaps made from bone and flint, a spoon-shaped instrument called an elevator, and a wooden bowl to catch whatever comes forth. The scalp is incised in a cross, peeled back, exposing the bone. The drill begins to turn slowly, patiently, not to penetrate, but to carve away a thin disc of skull. Sometimes the bone is brittle and flakes away. Other times, it resists. But eventually, a plug is removed, and beneath it, the pulsing membrane of the brain can be seen. If the wound seeps fluid, that is thought to be good. If it smells sweet or pungent, it may signal death. The hole is not closed. It is covered lightly, bandaged, allowed to remain open so that spirits might escape. Strange though it sounds, trepanning was often survived. Skulls from archaeological digs across Europe and Africa show healed bone margins, signs that the patient lived not only days, but years after the procedure. It was not always done for trauma. Sometimes it was done to treat epilepsy or melancholy, or voices heard in the night. In some cultures, it was thought to free the soul. In others, to drain the demons that shook a person in their sleep. There was no one reason and no one method, but there was belief. By the 12th century, trepanning had become more regulated in academic medicine, often taught in rudimentary surgical manuals and practiced under ecclesiastical scrutiny. Monasteries with infirmaries might have tools for the purpose, and illustrations in some surviving texts show diagrams of where and how to cut. They resemble alchemical charts more than anatomical ones, with stars and margins and holy symbols inked into the margins. The body, in this context, was not simply flesh, it was divine architecture. And to open, it was to walk its sacred halls. One must remember, too, that the medieval mind did not distinguish between the physical and the spiritual as we do today. To bore a hole in the skull was not merely to relieve pressure. It was to allow the invisible to move through the visible, to make space for healing, both earthly and eternal. The surgeon was not simply a cutter of bone, but a facilitator of grace. Not everyone believed in trepanning. Many saw it as dangerous barbaric, even and preferred bleeding or purging. Some sought charms instead, or relics said to cure madness. Others turned to the stars. Astrology was not a fringe belief, but a central pillar of medicine. A physician might consult a birth chart before prescribing a treatment, or choose the timing of a surgery based on planetary alignments. Jupiter favored growth. Saturn warned of decay. Venus ruled blood. Even the moon, in its swelling and waning, was thought to influence the tides of health within the body. Bleed under the wrong sign, and the patient might bleed too much. Trepan under the wrong moon, and the wound might fester. Charts were everywhere, some shaped like wheels, others like ladders or trees. They marked not only the body, but the hours of the day, the seasons, the days of the week. Some were richly illustrated, colored with ochre and gold. Others were crude, drawn in haste, copied from older manuscripts. But all served the same purpose, to bring order to the mystery of pain. And always, at the heart of it all, was imbalance. Too much heat, too much cold, too much dryness or moisture. The world of medieval medicine was not binary. It was a spectrum of flows and qualities, endlessly shifting. Bloodletting, trepanning, purging, sweating, and prayer were all means of restoring equilibrium. The body was not a machine. It was a garden. And when the garden withered, the surgeon came with tools that were part shears, part sacrament. Somewhere, far from the cathedral towns and university cloisters, a woman applies a leech to her child's fevered neck. She whispers an old rhyme to keep his spirit calm. The leech swells. The boy quiets. She watches his breath, waiting. She does not know the Latin for what she's doing. She has no chart. But she believes. And belief, for better or worse, is its own kind of medicine. Beyond the scalpels, beyond the bleeding bowls and jars of leeches, there existed a quieter, stranger corner of medieval medicine. A realm made not of flesh and bone, but of diagrams, dreams, and whispered beliefs. This was the world of the Zodiac Man, of bloodletting calendars inked into vellum, and of surgical amulets pressed against the skin in hopes of divine intervention. It was a world both arcane and oddly gentle, shaped more by the rhythms of the cosmos than by any clear understanding of anatomy. The Zodiac Man, or Homo Signorum, was a recurring figure in medieval medical texts, an illustrated human body overlaid with astrological symbols. His head belonged to Aries, his neck to Taurus, his stomach to Virgo, and his knees to Capricorn. In many depictions, he stands with arms outstretched, calm and passive, as if awaiting his fate. These diagrams were more than curiosities. They were tools. Physicians used them to decide when to cut and when to wait, when to bleed and when to fast. It was believed that harming a part of the body during its ruling zodiac sign could be fatal. So if you suffered from a toothache under Aries, best to wait until Taurus. These beliefs were not fringe or folkish. They were part of the educated medical canon, taught in university lectures, and copied into books with care. A typical bloodletting calendar might pair each day of the year with a vein to be opened, marked with a small red symbol. Some calendars went further, predicting favorable days for childbirth or dental extractions. They merged seamlessly with religious festivals, saints' days, and lunar phases, creating a rhythm of treatment that felt aligned with both the heavens and the church. Underneath this celestial medicine lay the very human need to predict, to understand, to soothe. In a world where so much was uncertain harvests, weather, war, plague chart, however inaccurate, was a comfort. It told you when to act, when to wait. It gave shape to the chaos. Surgery, meanwhile, was evolving. Though still primitive by modern standards, it was slowly collecting structure. By the 13th century, universities in Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier were beginning to categorize procedures. Manuals began to appear, such as Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac, which described tools, techniques, and case studies in long, flowing Latin. There were sections on cauterization, on setting broken bones, on removing bladder stones, on treating narrow wounds. Illustrations showed curved knives, sharp hooks, and complicated retractors. Some procedures were clearly impossible without killing the patient. Others were simple, even sensible. But even in the most advanced surgical treatises, there was space for the mysterious. Leeches still had a place, particularly in delicate situations where a blade would be too crude. A swelling behind the ear, an inflamed eyelid, a bruised testicle, all might be treated with a careful application of leeches. Trepanning was described with clinical detachment, but there was often a note of caution. Avoid cutting near the sagittal suture. Avoid drilling if the skull is soft from birth. Some writers included prayers to be recited during difficult surgeries. Others warned that a surgeon without humility would lose more patients than he saved. The balance between confidence and fear was thin. There were also the surgical talismans, small objects or inscriptions believed to aid healing. A strip of parchment bearing a saint's name wrapped around a wound. A ring engraved with symbols, worn during childbirth. A cross drawn in ash on the forehead of a child with seizures. These were not separate from surgery. They were part of it. A practitioner might carry both a scalpel and a charm. He might say a prayer before cutting or consult a horoscope before choosing a treatment. In a way, surgery was an act of ritual. We see this clearly in the blend of materials found in archaeological digs. In old monastic infirmaries, surgical instruments lie beside rosary beads. In battlefield graves, a bloodletting knife is buried with its owner. along with a pouch of herbs and a small wooden cross. In apothecary shops, jars are labeled not only with ingredients, but with symbols, alchemical signs, planetary glyphs, the shorthand of mystery. None of this was considered contradiction. Faith and flesh, the stars and the pulse, worked in tandem. Healing was not a straight line, but a tapestry. So now, return for a moment to that stone chamber from before. The candles have burned lower. The brazier has gone out. The tools are cleaned and re-wrapped. The leeches are back in their jar. And on the wall hangs a calendar, carefully inked, its days marked with red and black. The man who once lay on the table is breathing steadily. His head is bandaged. His fever has not returned. The surgeon sits beside him, murmuring a soft prayer. He is not certain of what he has done. He never is. But he believes. He believes in the chart. He believes in the stars. And above all, he believes in the old ways, handed down like fragile glass from those who came before, in the dim glow of a chamber lit by flickering candlelight. The ancient art of healing unfolds in quiet rhythms, slow and deliberate as the turning of the seasons. The tools, curved knives, small drills, tiny jars filled with writhing leeches, rest patiently on wooden tables, their purpose as much bound in ritual as in the flesh they serve to mend. Outside, the chill of night settles softly over the village, muffling footsteps and voices, inviting the weary to rest. But inside, the healer remains awake, their hands steady even as their thoughts drift across the mysteries that pulse beneath the skin. Medicine in this age is a delicate dance between the seen and the unseen, the tangible and the intangible. It is the interplay of physical action and spiritual faith, of knowledge handed down through fragile manuscripts, and the whispers of stars far overhead. The practitioner, whether a barber-surgeon with rough hands or a learned university-trained physician, knows that their art is not a precise science, but a fragile weaving of hope and understanding, bound by centuries of tradition and human need. The patient lies quiet on a simple wooden board, their breath measured, their eyes closed. Perhaps they suffer from a swelling that refuses to abate, or a fever that steals strength slowly like a cold mist. Their body is mapped not only by wounds or pains, but by the zodiac, each limb, each joint ruled by a star sign that tells a story of balance and risk. The healer consults a chart, a faded parchment inscribed with astrological symbols, reminding them when to prick a vein, when to leave the flesh untouched, and when to prepare for more desperate measures. Bloodletting, the ritual of releasing blood to restore balance, is an act both clinical and sacred. The lancet's cold touch draws a thin line of red, steady and sure, as the blood spills slowly into a bowl carved from wood or metal. The healer watches the flow with practiced eyes, seeking signs in its color and pace. Too fast, and the patient may faint. Too slow, and the ailment may persist. Around them, the air carries faint scents of herb sage, rosemary, and wormwood, burning gently to cleanse the space of lingering spirits. In some corners of this world, the use of leeches brings a gentler form of bloodletting. These small creatures, placed carefully on swollen flesh, suck slowly and silently, their work almost invisible yet powerful. The patient might feel only a slight tickle or a faint warmth as the leech feeds, a natural rhythm of ebb and flow, an echo of the balance the healer seeks to restore. Leeches are kept in jars of water, tended like fragile pets, a strange companionship between human and creature bound by necessity. Meanwhile, the practice of trepanning, boring a hole into the skull to relieve pressure or expel unseen evils, holds a different kind of weight. Though frightening to imagine, it is done with an odd calm, a ritualized precision honed through countless attempts and passed down through generations. The practitioner's hands are steady as they make the first incision, the scalp peeling back like a fragile curtain to reveal the bone beneath. The slow turning of a drill carves a small circle, a portal into the body's innermost sanctum. The The reason for such a procedure might be a violent blow, a seizure, or a creeping madness thought to be caused by trapped spirits. Though gruesome in the telling, the act is also one of faith, that through this opening, healing might come. Archaeological discoveries reveal skulls that bear the marks of this intervention, healed and whole, evidence of survival against odds. In these holes, the past speaks softly of resilience, of human beings reaching for relief in the dark. The instruments of this age reflect a world caught between craft and mysticism. Knives are forged with care, their edges sharpened not only by steel but by prayer. Bowls are simple, worn from use, yet the blood they catch is heavy with meaning. Manuscripts filled with diagrams offer guidance, but also warnings, reminding practitioners of the dangers inherent in each cut and the delicate balance between harm and healing. One cannot separate the physical from the spiritual in this time. The body is a microcosm of the cosmos, a reflection of divine order. To heal the body is to restore harmony to the soul, to bring the patient back into balance with the universe. Healing prayers are murmured softly over bandages. Holy relics are placed near the bedside. The cross is drawn in ash or ink to protect against malevolent forces. These acts of faith are as vital as any scalpel or leech. The cycle of healing is slow, patient, and filled with uncertainty. Some patients recover, their bodies mending like the earth after rain. Others do not, slipping away quietly in the night, their suffering a reminder of the limits of human knowledge. Yet even in failure, the rituals continue comfort for the living and a pathway for the departed. Through it all, the healer walks a narrow line between hope and humility. Their knowledge is partial, their tools imperfect. They are guided by tradition, by prayer, and by the ever-turning stars. Each day brings new challenges and old questions. Is the bleeding enough? Too much? Has the leech drawn the right balance? Will the hole in the skull bring relief or invite new harm? These questions are carried in the healer's heart like fragile lanterns, flickering against the gathering dark. And yet, the work continues, because it must. Because the need to care, to mend, to touch another human in their pain, is the oldest impulse of all. In the quiet moments after the patient sleeps, the healer cleans the tools with gentle hands, setting each one in its place. They look up to the window, where the moon traces a pale arc across the sky, and find in its steady glow a small comfort. The stars will continue their silent turning. The world will continue its slow turning. And in this small corner of time, the ancient dance of healing will go on. And as you listen now, perhaps in your own quiet space, you can feel the soft pulse of this distant time, the calm, the hope, the fragile human heart reaching through darkness toward the light. This is deep history for sleepers. The grand halls of medieval courts were worlds apart from the crowded tents of battlefield surgeons or the humble rooms of village healers. Here, the air smelled not of sweat and blood, but of incense and polished wood. Velvet drapes hung heavy, muffling footsteps on stone floors. Lanterns glowed with soft amber light, casting long shadows across tapestries woven with gold thread. In this world of privilege and ceremony, the role of the physician was a delicate blend of medicine, mysticism, and spectacle. Court physicians were figures draped in rich robes, embroidered with intricate patterns, their fingers adorned with rings heavy as the secrets they kept. They moved with a measured grace, their speech slow and deliberate, peppered with references to ancient texts and celestial charts. Unlike the rough hands of barber-surgeons, their touch was gentle, their presence commanding respect. Yet beneath the silk and gold lay a profession still steeped in mystery, where science and superstition wove a complex tapestry. One of the most fascinating threads in this tapestry was the use of unicorn powder, a substance believed to hold miraculous healing powers. Unicorns themselves were creatures of myth, elusive and pure, symbols of chastity and divine grace. To possess even a fragment of their horn was to hold a fragment of the sacred, a cure for poison, a balm for wounds that would not heal. Alchemists and apothecaries claimed to grind these horns into fine powders, selling them to the wealthy and powerful as cures for everything from the plague to melancholia. In the quiet rooms where court physicians prepared their remedies, jars of exotic herbs sat alongside small vials of shimmering powders. Some powders sparkled faintly in the candlelight, their origins a closely guarded secret. Others were colored with crushed gems or ground bones, their potency as much a matter of faith as chemistry. The unicorn powder was the most prized of all, whispered about in hushed tones and sought after with fervor. The use of such powders was not simply about physical healing, but about reinforcing status and power. To be treated with unicorn powder was to be marked as special, to partake in a ritual of care that transcended ordinary medicine. The court physician was as much a guardian of image and ritual as a healer. His treatments often involved elaborate ceremonies. Powders dusted onto cloths, oils anointed on the skin, prayers murmured under breath. Healing here was as much about mind and spirit as about body. Alongside powders, court physicians wielded a different kind of authority, the power of astrology and diagnosis. They kept detailed charts of the heavens, tracking the movements of planets and stars, aligning treatments with favorable celestial moments. A physician might declare a day unlucky for bloodletting, but propitious for the application of poultices. Their advice could dictate not only health decisions, but political ones, advising rulers when to launch campaigns or when to seek counsel. In a time when kings and queens saw their fates intertwined with the cosmos, such counsel was both valued and feared. Yet beneath the layers of ritual and spectacle lay the persistent uncertainty of medieval medicine. The court physician, no matter how learned or adorned, faced the same fragility of human life as his peers. The medicines were often no more effective than those prepared by village healers, and the mysterious powders no more potent than ground minerals. Patients still succumbed to disease, to infections, to injuries. The physician's knowledge was a blend of observation, inherited wisdom, and hopeful guesswork. But it was the hope that mattered most. In the grandeur of court, healing was as much a matter of faith and showmanship as science. The act of receiving care was a ritual that reinforced the power of the ruler and the authority of the healer. The fine robes, the rare powders, the precise charts all wove together a story of control amidst the chaos of sickness and death. In this contrast between the rugged battlefield tents and the silk-draped chambers of the court, we glimpsed the vast complexity of medieval healing. It was a world where science and superstition, ritual and reason, mingled in a slow, delicate dance. And through it all, the human desire to soothe pain and to find meaning in suffering endured. If you are still with me, I invite you to settle deeper into this story, to feel the hush of the court, the rustle of robes, the soft glimmer of powders under flickering lights. In these moments, the past whispers softly to us, inviting calm and quiet reflection. This is deep history for sleepers. In the palaces and courts of medieval Europe, physicians occupied a curious and precarious position. Their role demanded equal measures of scholarship, performance, and diplomacy. Though their robes were finely stitched, and their chambers lined with shelves of books and bottles, their security often rested not in the success of their treatments, but in the moods and whims of the monarchs they served. To be a court physician was to navigate power delicately, for failure could mean disgrace or worse. These physicians were often educated in the finest universities of the day, fluent in Latin, and trained in the works of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. Their understanding of the human body was filtered through ancient texts, astrological alignments, and centuries of interpretation. Dissection, for most of the medieval period, was rare and controversial. Much of what they believed about anatomy came not from direct observation, but from inherited authority. The body was a mystery cloaked in metaphor, with humors and spirits moving invisibly within. And yet, the expectations placed upon them were immense. When a noble fell ill, the court physician was summoned immediately, sometimes in the middle of the night. He would arrive with his leather case of instruments and tonics, a heavy volume tucked under his arm, his fingers smelling faintly of dried herbs and ink. Diagnosis might begin with the examination of urine held up to the light in a glass flask, its color and clarity studied with practiced solemnity. The pulse would be taken by touch, the skin observed, the breath listened to. Then would come the prescriptions, bleeding perhaps, if the moon permitted it, or the application of special ointments crafted from spices and animal fats, or a dose of electuary, a thick paste made from honey, rose petals, and powdered stones. The most elite might receive doses of substances so rare that their origins bordered on the fantastical. Crushed emeralds, powdered bezoar stones, and of course, unicorn horn. Despite their titles and connections, court physicians were often anxious. They knew their remedies were unreliable. And worse, they were deeply aware that when healing failed, they could become the target of suspicion. Was it truly an unlucky alignment of Saturn, or had the physician angered the stars with his incompetence? Or worse, had he been bribed to hasten a prince's demise? The court was a place of secrets and sharp glances. The line between healer and scapegoat was thin. Many court physicians, therefore, became experts not just in medicine, but in self-preservation. They learned to speak cautiously. They hedged their prognoses with polite uncertainty. They emphasized rituals and timing, so if a treatment failed, blame might be shifted to the stars or the patient's own imbalance. They aligned themselves with powerful allies and distanced themselves from conspiracies. Some even carried letters of protection from the Pope or King should accusations arise. And yet, despite these dangers, many pursued the path of court medicine willingly. The rewards could be immense: land, titles, money, even influence over royal policy. A trusted physician might be consulted on matters far beyond health-on treaties, marriages, or the hiring of other advisors. Their proximity to the throne gave them a unique view of the world, and for some, that was worth the risk. Physicians also had the privilege of access. They could move between chambers, speak with nobles and their servants alike, observe the intimate rhythms of royal life. They became confidants and witnesses, recorders of illnesses and secrets. When a queen miscarried, or a king grew weak and frail, it was the physician who remained close, offering what comfort and counsel he could. The court itself was not immune to spectacle. Physicians were sometimes expected to perform their craft in public view, especially when the patient was a noble or monarch, whose recovery was a matter of state interest. In such moments, the physician became part actor, staging rituals of care that reassured the court and projected control. The use of rare ingredients like unicorn powder wasn't just medical, it was symbolic, a declaration of wealth, holiness, and hope. Unicorn powder, in reality, often came from narwhal tusks imported from the Arctic, or from the horns of rhinoceroses, or sometimes from carefully carved bones. Its value lay not in its chemical properties, but in its perceived purity. To touch a fragment of unicorn horn was to touch a piece of the divine, and that idea carried a power of its own. In the royal gardens and apothecaries attached to the court, exotic plants were cultivated for medicinal use: saffron, ginger, cardamom, mandrake. The growing of these plants was itself a kind of art, requiring knowledge of soil, sunlight, and season. Physicians and their assistants would harvest them with care, drying petals, distilling roots, and blending them into tonics whose recipes were as closely guarded as any political secret. Within these spaces, a kind of quiet alchemy unfolded. Liquids were poured slowly through cloths, powders were ground with polished stones, and the air was thick with scents earthy, sharp, and strange. The creation of a remedy could take hours, even days, and often required silence, concentration, and prayer. Some believed that the very act of preparation, done with reverence, imbued the medicine with its healing power. The contrast with the battlefield was stark. There, pain was met with haste and steel. Here, in the court, pain was managed with ritual and gentleness. Even when remedies failed, the patient might drift away surrounded by soft fabrics, quiet music, and whispered prayers. Death, though no less final, arrived with dignity. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel the hush of those stone corridors, the echo of slippers on tile, the gentle clink of glass against metal. Imagine the physician bent over his desk, candlelight flickering across the pages of a well-worn book, his mind searching through centuries of wisdom for one more chance to save a life. This is deep history for sleepers. There is something especially peculiar about the way silence gathers in royal chambers. Not the silence of sleep, nor the stillness found in forests or monasteries, but a tensioned hush where servants stand just out of sight and courtiers breathe a little quieter, waiting. In that hush, the court physician enters, robes heavy with scent and purpose, eyes trained on the figure stretched across linen sheets. A king, perhaps, or a queen, or simply a noble with enough wealth to demand ritual, even in illness. The air smells faintly of beeswax, old wood, and something more herbal lavender, or yarrow, crushed recently in a brass mortar. On a nearby table rests a velvet pouch, tied with golden thread, and inside, a glimmering pinch of powder believed to be unicorn horn. It is, in truth, most likely narwhal tusk imported from cold northern seas, but that matters little to the man who lies ill. What matters is belief, that this shimmering dust might chase away whatever demons twist his gut, or cloud his vision, or take his sleep. Court medicine in the late Middle Ages was a theater of symbols. Remedies were expected to be rare and mysterious. No one wanted the same poultice used by peasants. It had to be exotic. Ground emeralds, pearls dissolved in vinegar, powder shipped from the Levant, sometimes named but often unknown. And unicorn horn was the most revered of all a cure-all, a protector against poison, and perhaps a proof that God favored the one who could afford such a thing. The physician's presence in the room was as much about reassurance as treatment. He spoke softly, quoted Galen and Avicenna, perhaps spoke of humors and balances. If the patient was jaundiced, he would mention an excess of yellow bile. If fevers were high, he might suggest the blood itself was overheated by celestial alignments. But always, the suggestion came wrapped in gentleness, a touch to the wrist, a murmured suggestion to change the bedding, a promise that the stars were beginning to shift. Much of what the court physician did was intangible, a performance, but not hollow, because belief has power, especially at an age when mystery ruled far more than evidence. When a noble took unicorn powder dissolved in wine, he believed he was swallowing protection itself. When a queen was bled beneath a crescent moon, she trusted the physician had timed it just right to balance her spirit and flesh. The physician might not fully understand disease, but he understood fear, and that made him useful. And yet, for all their finery, court physicians still wrestled with limits. The plague did not spare the wealthy. The sweating sickness respected no silk. In the face of epidemics, even the most educated doctor could do little more than recommend clean air, perfumed pomanders, and prayer. There were moments when the court's elaborate medical rituals fell apart, when physicians vanished from cities, when powders and amulets seemed no better than ashes. These were the moments that humbled even the most confident. Still, most of the time, court life clung tightly to its rituals. The daily routines of the court physician were shaped by ceremony, checking the chamber pots of nobles each morning for signs of imbalance, inspecting urine for color and smell, charting the movements of Saturn, Mars, and Venus to find the most auspicious days for intervention. Even diagnosis was poetic. Your melancholy is thickening. Your phlegm has risen too high. And treatments mirrored this language. Cooling drafts, harmonizing tonics, mood-balancing tonics of rose water and poppy. When foreign physicians visited, as sometimes they did from Moorish Spain or the Byzantine East, they brought with them their own interpretations. Courts loved this. Nothing delighted a ruler more than having physicians from multiple lands confer solemnly over a mysterious ailment, a convergence of knowledge, a performance of global wisdom. Sometimes the remedies clashed. One would recommend bloodletting, another, abstinence from food. But as long as the patient survived, both were praised. Behind the scenes, court physicians also carried secrets. They knew which nobles struggled with sleeplessness or trembling hands. They observed bruises that suggested more than a fall. They noticed which consorts bled irregularly, which royal children coughed more than they should. The physician was a keeper of quiet truths, never quite a spy, but never fully neutral either. To treat the body was to know too much. And so, physicians were both revered and quietly feared. Sometimes they used that power. A quiet word to a chamberlain, a note to a bishop. Their favor could elevate a servant to higher standing or cause one to disappear. This was not always malicious. More often, it was protective. Physicians, despite their robes and charts, remained servants of the court. Their survival depended not only on healing, but on tact. In the soft candlelight of night, when the court finally hushed into sleep, the physician might return to his small workroom. There, among books and mortar and pestle, he reviewed cases. Sometimes he prayed. Sometimes he just sat, listening to the quiet. For all the theater of his role, he too was afraid of sickness. He too had watched patients die despite his powders and promises. In these hours alone, he was simply a man trying to understand what no one fully could. And yet, he would rise with the dawn, robes clean, hands steady, words chosen with care. He would stand once again beside beds of velvet and silk, offering remedies made from stars, dust, and ancient names. And those who received them would listen, not just for healing, but for comfort, for the reassurance that even sickness, here in the courts of kings, could be contained by ritual and faith. By the late medieval period, court physicians had become more than medical figures. They were woven into the very fabric of monarchy itself. The rituals of health and healing became part of the performance of kingship. To rule justly, it was thought, a monarch had to remain in balance, not only with the realm, but within his own body. If he was ill, it was not simply misfortune. It could signal divine displeasure, or cosmic imbalance, or even a challenge to the legitimacy of the throne. As such, the role of the court physician deepened, becoming both mystical and political. Imagine for a moment the dawn breaking over a royal court. Servants whisper through cold corridors, fires are rekindled, and the first task of the day falls to the court physician. He enters the royal chamber quietly, bowing, perhaps muttering a Latin greeting. On the knit stand sits a glazed ceramic flask holding urine from the previous evening. The physician holds it up to the window's faint light, tilting it slightly, watching for sediment, color, clarity. This humble moment, examining a fluid, was seen as vital to maintaining a stable kingdom. A monarch might greet the physician with weary eyes, and a question not about medicine, but dreams. Dreams were seen as important indicators of internal imbalance, influenced by digestion, sleep, and the movement of celestial bodies. The physician listens, nods, and scribbles a few notes into a parchment-bound ledger. Then begins the ritual of pulse reading, the patient's wrist between two fingers, timing the beat with the rise and fall of breath. It is not fast medicine, but slow, ceremonial, gentle. Nearby, the apothecary is already at work. A pan of rose petals simmers gently in water. Dried mint and anise seeds are being ground with a pestle. Bottles of infused wine, aged for potency, are checked for mold or separation. A fragment of something rare perhaps, labeled Cornu unicornis, is weighed carefully on brass scales. No one questions whether it's truly from a unicorn. The name itself carries enough weight to matter. In another wing of the palace, a lesser noble, cousin to the queen perhaps, has taken ill. The physician sends an assistant, usually a young man trained in observation and discretion. He carries with him a pouch of warming spices, a measure of camphor oil, and a salve infused with frankincense. But more than these, he carries words. The words of the physician, wrapped in suggestion and tone, reassuring, dignified, controlled. The power of healing in such courts often came through language. This period also marked the time of growing curiosity about medicine. Universities had become more established. Medical texts were translated from Arabic into Latin, and knowledge, while still bound to astrology and humors, was broadening. But in the court, tradition still reigned. The most trusted remedies were those with lineage. A treatment once used on a Spanish queen, or a holy relic from the East, had greater appeal than an experimental tincture from a new physician. Court doctors frequently walked a narrow bridge between tradition and inquiry. They might correspond with learned colleagues in Paris or Bologna, sending coded letters about strange fevers or outbreaks. They read deeply but revealed sparingly. To offer a treatment no one had heard of could be seen as brilliance or heresy. And if it failed, the backlash could be ruinous. So they borrowed language from religion, cloaked remedies in ancient metaphors, and grounded innovations in the supposed practices of Greek or Persian predecessors. These physicians were not always male. Though rare, some women, often mystics, midwives, or herbalists, rose to positions of medical influence, particularly in female courts. Queens and noblewomen frequently retained their own healers, and these women often practiced quietly, drawing on folk wisdom, spiritual insight, and centuries of oral tradition. They were less likely to use unicorn horn, more likely to favor mugwort, fennel, or motherwort, depending on the need. They may not have worn robes of office, but their work was no less intricate or political. The concept of poisoning also brought physicians closer to danger. Poison was the great fear of courts, the silent killer that left no wound. To counteract it, kings demanded antidotes be kept on hand at all times. Treacle, or theriac, a complex mixture of up to 70 ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, and spices, was the most prized. A good court physician knew how to recognize the symptoms of poison, how to act swiftly, and most importantly, how to avoid accusations himself. One whisper of negligence or collusion, and the healer could become the suspect. When a monarch died, the physician was often asked to speak to the cause. This, too, required care. One could not simply say the king had aged or succumbed to weakness. The phrasing had to be precise, almost poetic. His humors thinned, or his breath failed as Mars entered its decline. These declarations were often recorded, sometimes turned into public notices or sermons. In this way, even in death, the physician's words shaped the memory of the ruler. Over time, skepticism would grow. The Renaissance would bring a thirst for anatomy, for dissection, for precision. But in the courts of the late Middle Ages, mystery still held sway. The physician remained a figure apart, not just a man of science, but a steward of balance. His robes carried the scent of amber and balm. His words carried the weight of tradition. And now, as the candles in those long-vanished palaces gutter and fade in our imaginations, the figure of the court physician lingers. Not quite a magician, not quite a doctor, a servant of bodies and stories. His work, like so much of medieval life, walked the line between what was seen and what was believed. May your own breath slow with the quiet rhythms of his world. May the hush of stone halls and the soft clink of glass soothe your thoughts. The court, for all its grandeur and illusion, reminds us of our shared vulnerability and our deep longing to be cared for, even in mystery. The last of the fires burns low, and the tent flaps have long since stopped moving. Somewhere, far off, a bird begins to call, greeting a gray, uncertain morning. In this space between waking and sleep, you may still be holding the lingering fragments of all we've wandered through. the battlefield tent with its flies and screaming men, the noble whose life turned on a single cut, the jars of leeches and whirling charts, the velvet robes of the court physician and his shimmering powders. The medieval world of medicine was not a world of certainties. It was a place where healing came with guesswork and hope, with ritual and instinct. Some healers worked with their sleeves rolled up, hands caked in blood and mud. Others stood in candlelit halls, murmuring prayers over tinctures made from theriac and unicorn horn. And in between the battlefield and the court, between the cries of soldiers and the whispers of kings, stood the barber-surgeon. Scissors in one pocket, saw in the other. A man who might cut your beard in the morning and your leg in the afternoon. It was a brutal time to be wounded, and perhaps an even stranger time to be healed. You've seen how amputation could turn a kingdom's fate, how sacred powders, worthless or not, gave hope to queens and emperors, how a chart of stars might decide whether your blood should be drained, or whether your soul had simply tilted out of balance. And now, perhaps, you understand a little more about why you'd hate being a barber-surgeon in a medieval battlefield tent. Not because of the gore, not even the screaming, but because of the weight of it, the confusion, the smell of fear and rot and ale, the feeling that no one really knew what they were doing, and yet it was still up to you. In the end, all these people, barber-surgeons, noble physicians, herbalists and apothecaries, men and women, were all trying to do the same quiet thing. They were trying to help someone else survive the day, even if that help came with a bone saw, or a leech jar, or a muttered blessing over a bowl of rose water. Sleep now, if you haven't already. Let the tools be set aside. Let the charts roll up and the tents fall silent. You've walked a long road with us, from tent to throne, through wounds and wonder. And maybe, somewhere in all of it, you found something unexpected, something human. This has been Deep History for Sleepers. If you're still with me, I'd love to know what part stayed with you.